Well, thank you very, very much for that beautiful introduction. I'm hearing an echo, but that's okay, I think. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful conference. And of course, we wish we could all be physically together, but that's not going to be long before that happens. I am so glad that you wanted to talk about water, the commodification and privatization of water in relation to the issue of food and health, because they're so deeply interrelated. We are talking about post-COVID moving to really an understanding of a new kind of food production, which is in many ways an old kind of food production system that we have to either protect and maintain, excuse me, or go or move on to. But I'm going to say to you today that we cannot protect small-scale regenerative agroecology if local communities and small farmers, family farmers, peasants, and so on, cannot control and access their local water sources. And one of the things that I've been fighting so hard is how large corporations, large now hedge fund investors, equity investors, big ag investors are moving in to take control of those local water systems. And that gives them a huge advantage because of the amount of money, the deep pockets that they have in terms of outbidding local farmers. So it's absolutely impossible for us to create the kind of food production systems that we want to fight the factory farms, the big ag, the heavy chemical dependent, export-oriented corporations, ag corporations, if we're not dealing with the need to protect and maintain water as a public trust and democratic control of that water. And just to remind us, just not going to go into a great deal of stats or anything, but we are a planet running out of clean, accessible water, which is something we all learned back in grade 6 or whatever, that couldn't happen. There's a certain amount of water. It's finite. It's the same amount, but it's also the same water that was on the planet when the dinosaurs were here. It's incredible when you think of that. And yes, it's true that water is still here, but the demand for it is growing exponentially and the supply is going down. We are polluting it, we're depleting it, we're diverting it, we're over extracting it, we're damming our rivers to death. And we need to understand that we can't see ourselves as above nature, above water. Water is not a resource for our pleasure, profit, and industrial growth. It is the most sacred thing that we can honor. It gives us all life, and without it, we don't exist, and neither does the planet. And there's a human cost to this crisis, of course, for those who cannot buy their way out of the crisis. When COVID broke about a year and a bit ago, you'll remember the first thing we were all told was wash your hands with soap and warm water. That's so important. Well, it turns out that over half the population of the world doesn't have a place to wash their hands with soap and warm water. In many countries and communities, the local healthcare clinic doesn't have running water, the schools don't have running water, and so on. So it really has shone us, COVID has shone us a spotlight on this crisis. And I think that could be a silver lining coming out of this, because health leaders, governments, NGOs everywhere are learning that we can't fight a pandemic like this without access to clean water. Now, there's a mighty contest around the fact that the world's water is diminishing and the prices, of course, are rising. And that is whether we see it as a commodity to be put on the open market like oil and gas or running shoes or cars or whatever, or whether it's a commons, which of course you will not be surprised to think that I'm on that side. But this is a very important discussion and debate, because we're building laws and practices and regulations based on whether we think it's a commodity or a commons. And those are profoundly different ways to look at water. Those who would have us see it as a market tool, an asset, and one of nature's assets that we can bring into the market, say, well, let the market decide, and the market will set the price, and that will take care of water. Well, yes, I suppose it will. Millions and millions more will die because they can't afford water, but it certainly will the price of water could keep it out of access to so many, but that's obviously couldn't be the answer. And there are many, many ways that we're commodifying water. Privatization of municipal services is one. Although we have brought back, I think it's to date, 334 municipalities, including big ones like Berlin and Paris, that tried privatization and said that's not for us and came back. There's also, of course, bottled water, where the people in the world are buying 1 million bottles of plastic water every minute. If you were to put them end to end, they would reach to the sun, halfway to the sun. That's every year's use. Aside from the terrible plastic pollution, we're destroying local springs. There's also mining companies getting 30, 40, 50-year leases to water to dump their toxins in. Well, that's a form of privatization. So it is when a big agribusiness or a big investor sets up in the global south, they get access not just to the land, when we call land grabs, but they get access to the water, and that's a form of privatization. But what I wanted to emphasize today is the concept of water trading, because it's the one that's most connected to discrimination against small farmers, small scale farmers, family farmers, and so on. And that is the water trading is basically where you separate the water from the land and allow it to be bought and sold on the open market. So it's kind of like a cash crop. And around the world, many owners of water, where water is being allowed to be trading, are seeing it more as a cash crop and not producing on their lands anymore. And water trading, water markets basically give the large industrial agribusinesses huge advantages over small scale farmers, because the small scale farmers just can't compete in the open market in the way that these companies can, with their billions and with their investors behind them. I'll give you 3 quick examples. The first is Chile. Dictator Pinochet brought in a water code that basically opened up all, all of Chile's water to the market economy. It said all of it's for sale, every single part of it, including to foreign companies, not just the privatization of water services. They did that too, but the lakes and rivers and groundwater is all for sale. So of course, big mining companies came in and they bid against local farmers and local indigenous communities and so on, and they've got the money. And this happened, I'm embarrassed to say a lot of those companies are Canadian. But we also had the situation where big agribusiness, usually foreign, usually export oriented, chemical dependent, took control of the food production in Chile. And over the drought that's been happening in the last few years, small farmers are leaving farming in droves. It's a real crisis in Chile. And it started with this water code. Allowing these water markets. And it's important to know there's lots of hope. I'm writing a new book on hope. And the hope here is that the people of Chile have demanded a new constitution, and they've removed the water code. So they're working this through now. Then there's Australia. In 1992, Australia converted water licenses. That's where the government agency grants licenses to a farmer or a business, an industry, whatever, bottled wine company or whatever, for a certain access to water. And they thought, well, if we convert it to rights where that they can sell, then they'll conserve and then make money on the extra. Well, of course, it didn't work like that. The small farmers got bought up by the big farmers. The big agribusiness got bought up by the banks and the big foreign investors. The price of water went through the roof. When severe drought hit, the government of Australia tried to buy the water back, and it couldn't. They couldn't afford it because it was now in the hands of private investors. And Australia is in a terrible situation. I mean, the fires in Australia are not just related to climate change as we know it. And I want to emphasize this. Climate change, yes, of course, impacts water, but our abuse of water is also a cause of climate change. When we remove water or vegetation from a local hydrologic cycle, we impact the climate in a negative way. And protecting and restoring watersheds is one of the ways that we can deal with, we can counter climate change. It's one of the major solutions to climate change. We could end every greenhouse gas emission in the world tomorrow. We would still have a crisis with water. And it's really important to realize that there are kind of streams here that we need to look at. So Australia is dealing with these massive fires and drought, and put their water up for sale to the world, basically. Now, in the United States, as my third example, Texas and California and Arizona, these are Western states that invited people 100 years ago, ranchers and farmers and industry miners, to come west. They said, we'll give you permanent access to water rights and they will be inherited. You can give them to your grandkids and so on. But now, and if you inherit those rights, if you don't use all that water, you get it taken away from you. So people are using water they don't necessarily need. But what they started to do a few years ago by law is allow the farmers and ranchers and industry to separate the water from the land and sell it separately. And so they just stop farming it's water as a cash crop. And again, California is in real crisis. There's a hedge fund called Water Asset Management, and they said this recently: the American water business is the biggest emerging market on earth. And that's because California produces so much of the food, so many of the commodities that are used in the United States, but around the world. So they're using local water, that dramatically declining local water. And so the crisis is upon us. And it's a long story of trying to even think about how to get the Western provinces in the United States to confront this, because it's so historic, but they're going to have to do this. The Nature Conservancy, which is a very powerful international environmental NGO, says that there are now 37 countries that have one form or another of water trading. And they say that water trading is the answer. They're not alone among big environmental NGOs that are promoting water trading, the water market, as the way to deal with the global water crisis. The OECD, the Organization for Economic and Cooperation Development, which is kind of the rich countries club, is also promoting water markets. There's a recent report that they're saying the water crisis in Brazil, which has been entirely caused by cutting down the Amazon and destroying those currents, those liquid currents, those what they call sky rivers, that took water from the forests and pulled it south, and not anymore. You've taken down enough of the Amazon, and that doesn't happen anymore. So what does the OECD say? They don't say stop taking down the Amazon. They say start water markets and put it on the open market. And then the local latest, and this is moving from sort of privatization to commodification to financialization. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange has announced about a month and a half ago that they're open for speculation on water futures. Now, the difference between water futures and the stock exchange on a water asset portfolio is that you're no longer talking about actual water, you're talking about water futures. So it's water as an asset. Nobody's going to touch the water that's investing in this. You're investing in drought. You're investing in crisis. You're assuming that there's going to be crisis, and it's coming for sure in California again. And so you buy massively and hold that amount at a certain price, wait for a few years, and then you can make a fortune selling it. Now, who can afford to do that? It's not your small scale farmer. It's not your family farm. It's not a farm growing organic food. It's not agroecology followers, right? It's the big industrial farmers, farm operations. I shouldn't even call them farmers necessarily. And it's really a very disturbing trend. Pedro Arroyo Agudo is the new UN, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights to water and sanitation. And this is what he said. I want you to listen to this, because he says this move for the financialization of water on the mercantile exchange. So this is derivatives. This is betting on the future. He said this about it. He says it's a violation of the human right to water. And he says such a future market could lure speculators such as hedge funds and banks to bet on prices, repeating the speculative bubble of the food market of 2008. In this context, the risk is that the large agricultural and industrial players and large-scale utilities are the ones who can buy, marginalizing and impacting the vulnerable sector of the economy, such as small scale farmers. Now, there's from the UN Special Rapporteur who says this is a very dangerous trend, and he is actually right now writing an extremely important report on the commodification and financialization of water and comparing it to what's happened with food. So where are we on this? Well, that's the bad news, and there is a fair amount of bad news, but there's lots of good news. And the lots of good news is that we have built a water justice movement, a global water justice movement. And it's been an incredible honor of my life to be a great part of it. I've written many books and many reports and traveled all over the world and met people from the United Nations to, you know, the poorest communities on earth. And really, when I say to you that this is a crisis that's coming, it's like the perfect storm of declining water, excuse me, declining water sources, growing inequality among countries, but also within countries. And don't think it's just in the global south. There are something like 15 million people who get cut off, have their water shut off in the United States every year because they can't afford to pay. And then rising water rates. So this perfect storm is got to be stopped if we're going to move to a more sustainable world, a more sustainable planet, and take care of our planet. We really did want to get the United Nations to recognize the human right to water and sanitation, and it was a big fight. I am Canadian. At the time, back in 2010, my then government was the leading opponent of the human rights to water and sanitation. I was mortified in the work I did at the UN. People would say, can't you get your government to do something? And I'd say, we're trying, but it was a really right-wing government. And we have crises in Canada around our First Nations and the treatment of First Nations and lack of water and access to sanitation. And I think that they thought, well, if water becomes recognized as a human right, then we have an obligation around First Nations in Canada. And they're right, we held that against them, and we still hold it against them. But all countries have now adopted this resolution, all countries. And something like 4 dozen countries have now either amended their constitution to include the human right to water, or brought in separate legislation, separate law to that effect. And we've got a number of important court cases, which I've documented, where the human right to water resolution has given people fundamental rights that have been taken from them. So it was a real thing. I mean, I keep saying, people say, well, what's the difference? Because there's still a crisis out there. And I say, yeah, well, we outlawed torture in 1948. Torture still exists horribly. But as a human family, we said that's not okay. And as a human family, we said it's not okay for someone to have to watch their child die of waterborne disease because they can't afford water, right? They can't pay for it. We said it's more than a need that can be given by charities or by government welfare. It is a human right. It's everyone's human right. And that's a very different lens to put on your eye or your glasses when you're looking at this issue. And it really is something I think we need to understand and hold on to and bring back to our own struggles. We've also been fighting, as I said earlier, the privatizations. When municipalities privatize their water services, they soon learn that the rates go up, the quality goes down, the number of public services declines, the number of workers working for them declines, because they have to take the same amount of money and find 10 to 20% investment profit for their investors, right? So they can't give you the same quality of service as a municipal government agency. We've been fighting bottled water around the world. I've been fighting Nestle for years and years. Nestle is the biggest of them. They own many bottled water companies, and they just sold their North American operations, which are large, to a big equity firm. So it's going to make it in a way kind of more difficult to fight. But fight on, we will. And we're fighting this water trading really, really very, very clearly. We're seeing it as a dangerous trend, including something called water pollution trading, which is just like your carbon offsets, where you get to continue to pollute, but you do something somewhere else far away, or you give money somewhere else far away, and that kind of eases your conscience, and that allows you to continue to nutrient trade or whatever. And I just want to say here that I'm very worried about the use of language around bringing water and nature into the market as natural capital, natural assets, ecosystem services. I think we should all be really, really careful about that language, because it's basically saying the market is fine. The growth, excuse me, the growth economy is great. Don't stop that. Just bring nature in and let the market rules produce a different result. And I think that that is fundamentally wrong. Post-COVID, we know that the private sector has failed us in terms of vaccine equality, in terms of protective equipment, in terms of the supply chains all getting broken, because of course the least interruption and they're going to get broken. Governments around the world are saying we won't be caught again not being able to protect our people, and that there's a role, strong role for government, good government, not bad government, good government. And we have the right to be demanding it. And then there's our Blue Communities Project, which was referred to, excuse me, in the introduction. And that is started in Canada. And I'll talk a little bit more about this on the panel, but it started in Canada. And it really was the same government that opposed the human right to water at the UN was saying to municipalities in Canada, if you want federal funding for infrastructure upgrading or new infrastructure for water, you have to go to a public-private partnership. And we didn't like that. So we got to the municipalities first and said, you take a pledge that you won't let that happen. And to become a blue community, you promise three things. One is that you'll protect and promote water as a human right. The second is that you will protect it as a public trust, so no privatization. And the third is if there's clean, safe water coming out of the taps, there should be no bottled water on municipal premises, at council meetings, at concerts that the municipality puts on. Bern, when it became the first city outside of Canada to become a blue community, added supporting public partnerships in the global south as opposed to public-private partnerships. And a number of others, a number of the other municipalities, major municipalities in Europe decided to follow suit. And so they added that fourth provision, which was very exciting. We now have something like 25 million people living in official blue community municipalities, including big ones like Vancouver and Montreal and Berlin and Paris and Bern and Los Angeles. These are very important, and Brussels. This is a very important movement, and it's moved into universities. We're now seeing it beginning in schools. The World Council of Churches became a blue community a few years ago, and they have something like 580 million Christians that are part of their community, all of them having pledged to become a blue community. So it's a positive vision. It's a way to say, as I said earlier, that water is sacred and that we must care for it, or we and our planet won't have the kind of future that we need. So my time is up. I want to say that it's been the incredible honor to work in this kind of movement. I remember being in Cochabamba, Bolivia, when just before and after there was a revolution, probably the first water war in the world in the sense that we understand it, where the World Bank had forced Cochabamba to bring in a private company to run their water services, signed the contract, didn't even involve the government, basically. It's like, you're too stupid to be able to figure this out. And the company brought in a private, set up a private for-profit water system. The first thing they did was triple the price of water, which of course it's a largely indigenous community and they couldn't afford it. And then they said, oh, and by the way, we own the rain. So anything you capture from the rain, we're going to fine you if we find you, hoarding rainwater. Unbelievable. So there was a revolution and people took to the streets and someone was killed by the army, but it forced the World Bank to back away. The company left, the water reverted to public hands, and the incoming government then kicked the other private water company out of La Paz, the capital. So this was one of the very first assertions. And I worked very, very closely with Oscar Oliveira, who was the leader of this revolution in Cochabamba. And I remember saying to him, where did you get the courage to stand up to the army and the World Bank, you know, the market of the world? And he said, because I would rather die of a bullet than thirst. And I've never forgotten that. That stood with me. And it stood with me when I was at a press conference out in Calgary, in Alberta, where we have huge oil operations, a huge energy sector, and they're producing very dirty energy and a lot of fracking. And they're downstream from one of the major operations. A lot of the First Nations people are getting sick. And we were at a press conference after having toured the tar sands, they're called, or the oil sands. And we were with a young activist from the local First Nations Indigenous community. And he said, everyone, you know, people are getting killed, dying. They're dying of cancer, the bile duct cancer, and babies we've never had in our history. Our elders are all dying. He said, and this reminded me of Oscar, he said, it would be kinder for you to come in and shoot us than do it this way. So I want you to understand that this is a life and death issue that we're dealing with water. Very, very much so. Living in a place like Bern, Switzerland, or Canada, it's perhaps harder to see because we still, excuse me, it's an old cold, we still have lots of water per capita, but our glaciers are melting, and the issues that are touching the world are going to touch us. And anyway, even if we did have more water forever and ever, we need to care about what happens in other parts of the world. So the fight for sustainable food, for soil restoration, for forest restoration, for wetland restoration is really coupled with the fight against the commodification of water. Because if we allow water, as it's being now taken bit by bit by bit into private hands, they might be nice people, I don't know, but they're in business. And if you're a big corporation, your bottom line is what counts. Can you sell more than your competitor? Well, if you externalize your waste, yes, you can. And so they, without rules, without the proper rules, this is where they stand. Martin Luther King said, legislation may not change the heart, but it will restrain the heartless, which I think is one of the loveliest things ever said. And I'm just going to end because my time's up, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with you and the panel. But this is one of my favorite people. His name was Carl Sagan, late Carl Sagan. Was an American environmental scientist. And he had a wonderful TV program. Some people might have seen it. He used to talk about billions and billions of stars or billions and billions of molecules. He just loved science and nature. And he said this, and I'll leave you with this. He said, anything else you are interested in is not going to happen if you cannot breathe the air and drink the water. Don't sit this one out. Do something. You are, by accident of fate, alive at an absolutely critical moment in the history of our planet.